hey, I am going to take charge of my stories and I'm going to move them and change them because I'm the one sitting with them. I'm the only one in here that has access to change them. And it's not the heat or the conversation or somebody else talking that's making us miserable. At a certain point, it's like, wow, no, my story is about them, or the internal stuff in the landscape that I need to change. I have some thoughts on what is both identity and responsibility. I'm talking about this as a journey of identity, as in one sense, but it's also a journey of responsibility. But let's weave that into how identity is a point of view, responsibility is a point of view, mindset, perspective. Can all apply that to identity, responsibility, and the journey. So I'll share a story that helps kind of frame this. And the reason I use a story, and I'll often use stories, is because our mind can remember stories and kind of can connect together many complex pieces and relate them that we can't do with individuals, facts, or data. So there's a purpose for what I'm saying, how I'm saying it. So the story is from my personal experience. I was in a sweat lodge. This is years ago. And if you've ever been in a sweat lodge, for me, sometimes they can be uncomfortably hot. And so I'd have experiences in the beginning where they'd be uncomfortably hot. And part of my mind would just be whining. And actually at the time often felt like I felt, why do they have to make it so damn hot? Can't they see this is uncomfortable? You know, how much longer is this going to go on? Can I go get some air? And I was whining and suffering. And people would be going around the circle, sharing their individual process, their prayers, their wishes, their desires, their songs. And my mind could be whining like, why are they taking so long? Was like, can't they see this is doesn't feel good? And what about me? And this is terrible. So I'd have experiences like that sometimes in a sweat lodge. And sometimes I've had experiences to where I'm just breathing. I'm with my breath. Maybe it's a song we sang, feels really beautiful. And we came out, we were doing it under the stars by the fire. Just a really beautiful experience, really feeling kind of joy and peace and loving everybody in the sweat lodge. And so I've had both experiences in a sweat lodge. And this particular sweat lodge, I'm having one of those really joyful, loving, connect to the universe, just peace and presence everywhere, which is really just how I felt. But then it was going on for a while. And person pouring water was pouring more water and was more hot and steamy, and one or two people were taking a really long time with what they were sharing. And I started to get annoyed, and I was like, why can't they hurry up? You know, it's like this is starting to get uncomfortable. And I thought, where did that lovely, joyful feeling go? And so I refocused my attention to my breath, the feeling and sensations, relaxed my body. Oh, and I was fine again. I felt really joyful sitting there in the lodge. Same temperature, same situation as just a few moments before when I was whining and suffering. And so I sat there breathing and kind of like really enjoying it. And after a little while, my mind started to whine and complain, or maybe it was me who started to whine and complain. I don't know exactly how it was working at the time. And I felt terrible and I was suffering. And this was taking too long, and these people were talking too much, and this was too hot, and I was uncomfortable where I was sitting, and my body was aching, and I wanted to move, and there wasn't room, and I was miserable again. And I thought, where did that joyful, pleasant feeling go? I just had it, like, okay. So I put my attention back in my breath, and I'm breathing, and I relax my body, and I go, well, let's not worry about those things. Let's just be here in the moment. And none about the what if about the problems was going on in a narrative. And I sat there in this kind of this joyful, quiet, peaceful state. And then my mind started it again. And I started to notice, like, wow, it's happening. And I could see it happening this time. I was like, it's going to start happening. And it's there, it started happening, except it was a little farther away, and I watched it as my mind. And I could feel myself go into it. Son of a gun, I'm suffering. And I put my attention on my breath and present, relaxed, and there it was. I was joyful and peaceful. And then my attention, point of view, started to drift into the story, and I was suffering. I was miserable. I was like, well, that doesn't feel good. And I put my attention, my point of view back in my heart, and it felt joyful and peaceful. And then my mind kind of pulled my attention and my perception back into the story, and I'm suffering. And I was like, wow, I am going back and forth between suffering in this situation and joyful and peaceful in the situation, but the situation is not changing. But what I could see change was my point of view was going into the story, judgments and criticisms and complainings, basically victim and judgment point of view, or back into presence, heart, moment, and just feeling kind of this radiant joy. And it was this delicate balance, as if I was on a teeter-totter. I was like, oh, I'm a little off balance, suffering, story, judgment, criticism, complaining. This is terrible. And I could pull my awareness and attention and perception back into my body in the present moment, just breathing with what I felt, and everything was fine. I felt joyful and peaceful. And it wasn't the person talking, it wasn't the temperature, it wasn't my body being uncomfortable that was making me miserable. It was being in the story about all of that. And when I wasn't in the story, I was just in the present moment. Felt great. And this is the difference in what we call a point of view of our identity shifting from a present self into a story version inside a victim complaining narrative, inside a judgmental, critical narrative. I was inside the character telling the story, and the character telling the story was in my mind. And when I was in that point of view, I was miserable and suffering because I was in the story about what was going on in the sweat lodge. But when I was really in the sweat lodge, feeling myself sweat, feeling my body sit there, it was just all okay and beautiful. And so I spent that time in the sweat lodge as people were going around, just slowly going back and forth and feeling my attention and perception moving into a story and suffering and how that felt, and bringing it back. And it would drift back into a story, and I have to like bring it back. And it was the most subtle of things to shift my point of view, my attention. But it completely changed my experience, what it felt like to be sitting in a sweat lodge breathing, or to be sitting in a sweat lodge breathing, but inside a story of judgment, identity, or victim identity stories. So you'll find a lot of the sessions in the self-mastery course, and even one of the free ones about attention is about perception. It's about this What is happening with your sense of identity, your point of view of perception? Are you viewing things from the point of view and lens of a story, character of a judge, character of a victim, or are you in the present moment just noticing sensation and feeling? Which generally is all just fine, and there's no suffering about it. Even if it's painful, it can be like, yeah, it's painful, but without a story, it's like, well, it just is what it is. So one of the biggest things about our conditioning into our belief system, into our identity as a person and our personality through our life is we just not only get stories about ourselves, we get conditioned into a certain point of view, lenses, perception, identity of who we are. There's something wrong with me, victim identity. I'm right, they're wrong, a judgmental criticism, idea of who we are as being right. They've mistreated me. It's an injustice. I've been treated unfairly. I've done something wrong. I've overreacted. I'm a problem. All this versions of ourselves are in stories, ego stories, and they all kind of fixate us into perception. They fixate us into the narrative of story. Underneath, that's all the beliefs. And a lot of the self-mastery work, the recapitulation work, all of it is not just change your story, but change your point of view of perception, your sense of self. What is that you, the presence that can move out of a story and see things without a story, see things without a victim or judge perspective, or without a fear perspective, without a feeling I have to be right, I have to defend. Those all are just movements of our identity. So a lot of this has to do with, to be able to do this, is you have to dissolve, unstructure, deconstruct the stories and narratives, beliefs we built, the emotional reactions we built as repetition through childhood, where we created these false forms of our identity. And in that, two major ones, we're judgmental. We're judgmental. I remember the first time I met my mentor at a talk he gave, I sat in the back and judged him, thinking like it was really rude that he was late. So I walked in, not aware that I was being judgmental, but feeling totally justified and I'm right and he's wrong for showing up late. And underneath that, little did I know at the time how big of a victim I was, that was hiding underneath, and that I deserved to be treated better and he should have showed up on time and he wasn't that late. I was victimized by all that, but I didn't see that layer. I was busy being right and feeling superior on top of it in my narrative story. I was suffering and I was miserably unhappy in my life. But that's the kind of narrative and point of view I was very quick to be in at the time. Okay. So we all grow up learning rules, learning to be right, to feel like we deserve to be punished when we're wrong or not good enough, that we struggle to be good enough. We're worried about what other people think of us. We're judgmental of people with our opinions, and it's easy to be critical of people. So two of the big identities are the victim and the judge that are part of these narrative story constructs to deconstruct, okay? And since society lives largely in those narratives, check out anything on the news and social media, those are the prominent narratives. It looks normal. It looks normal, but it doesn't mean normal is healthy. It's incredibly emotionally unhealthy. And if you look at children, early age, they don't have much of that. They're busy playing and having fun. They're not trying to defend themselves and be right. And if they get hurt, they're quick to apologize or say they're sorry. And they let their story go and they go back to playing and having fun. But we adults, we get rigid in our stories and we suffer a lot, like I did in the sweat lodge, and think it's somebody else's problem and somebody else's fault that I'm suffering, when it's really my story about them that is creating my suffering. I suffer when I'm in a victim narrative. I suffer when I'm in a judgmental narrative. And part of the awakening in this journey is we show up here wanting to change how we feel. And what we focus here in the self-mastery world is that means change your story. And part of you changing your story is you have to move out of the identity of the judge or the victim or whatever other character is telling it. And that involves awareness. Be aware of A, what the story is, what emotions you're living in, and be aware of what's the character, the point of view of the mind telling the story. And in that awareness, change happens. Just like when I was sitting in that sweat lodge and I was going back and forth between suffering in a story and feeling at peace. That was happening because I was aware. I was aware of this little mechanism of identity in a story, out of a story. Identity in a story, out of a story. Oh, presence in my body and a breath. That feels really nice. Pleasure. Oh, drifting into a story. I was aware of what is my point of view. And in that awareness, I was like, oh, let me move out of where I put my attention in the story and let me not believe that. Let me put my attention in my breath, my body, sensations, and those all feel nice. Back to pleasure and enjoyment and peace. So that awareness is what you need to have in order to steer your attention and to steer your perception. Okay? Now, we've been at this a long time. We've been conditioned over lots of repetition of where to put our attention. You know, how many times my parents say, hey, listen to me when I'm talking to you. Or the teachers there at class, pay attention. We're taught, put our attention on some external person of authority. And we grow up in adulthood continuing to do that. And so this is a pretty rebellious act to say, I'm going to look to have control over my attention. I'm not going to abdicate my power, my authority to somebody else over my story. And I'm actually going to look at the story in my head and let it go. So the game afoot is to let go of that domestication, conditioning, and the unconscious beliefs we build from it. And the sense of identity that one takes is, we show up here often kind of with a judgmental, because we're suffering, we're unhappy with something, want to change how we feel. There's certainly at the core of that kind of this victim perspective of the narrative that we live in. Maybe fears of that victimhood, what other people think, afraid of what other people think of us, feeling not good enough. Those are all kind of victim-based narrative stories. And then we get into victim narratives like, oh, will this work for me? Fear and doubt. Other people can do this, but I can't. I'm problem, struggling, which is everybody's phase of the process. But that kind of fear and doubt also is a victim narrative story. In the, that everybody that I know does this work goes through. I mentioned in a recent recording, even me struggling and falling down at times and feeling like I'm just going to quit because I'm not getting this right. And almost the victim character talking me into stopping. So that change in victimhood is you have to give up that identity. That I and me that is talking in that story is not you. And that giving up an identity is your personal journey of awakening and change. And the narratives of the judge of being right and supposed to, and this is how it's supposed to work, and this is what's good enough and not good enough, and what they should be, and that's all based in the critical voice of the judge, which you learn from somebody else's ideas that somebody else gave you because they had judgments and rights and wrongs and good and bads and supposed tos and not supposed tos, right? So you're going to let go of that as well. And you're moving into a different sense of identity we'll call consciousness. Identity that's not based in stories, victim and judge, but of consciousness and presence. And from my mentor, Miguel Ruiz, that identity often is a good one to take on is we'll call the warrior. Because you find out that, like I did in that sweat lodge, that I'm suffering in a story and I want to change my life and I need to change these stories, and like, I'm going to change this. And it's a declaration of change. I am going to change this, or I'm going to do everything I can to change it. That commitment, that declaration of change is where you become a warrior. Doesn't mean you know how it's going to change or the skills you need or how long it's going to take. You decide, I have to do this. If I'm going to be happy, I need to have agency over my narrative, story, and thoughts. I can't let these characters and their thoughts run me. I can't just go get entrained in them and suffer. I need to have that balancing point where I can go, no, I'm not going to go in that story. I'm going to be in the present moment and breathe. Reconnect with my center. You have to fight. You have to make a commitment of resolve and fight to say, I'm going to do that. Get agency over my attention, my perspective, and not abdicate my power to the story of the victim, the judge, or other characters. And so you're leaving the identity of the judge, you're leaving the identity of the victim, you're declaring this change, this kind of this, I'm not going to let these ego stories get me and get control of my attention. Declaration of war against the ego and fear and lies in our mind. And so you're moving out of judge identity, out of victim identity, into warrior identity, into conscious presence identity, into something else. Probably presence is the best word for it. And then we might say from that central feeling, realizing, wait a minute, there's more I can do here than just tell the story the old judge and victim way. From this state of peace and love, I want to connect with other human beings. I want to create something beautiful. I want to be present with other people. And you start building from that emotional presence and love and joy and peace outward, connecting with other human beings, and you create different relationships. And for people who want to bring their judgment and victim stories, you may have to put up some boundaries and goes, wait a minute, let's find a different tone for that conversation, or pause and relax. And let's listen. And so you have a lot of cleaning up to do. And people might go, what the hell's the matter with you? I used to listen and just take this before. And you're like, well, I'm treating myself better now. So all sorts of things like boundaries need to be put in place. But then you're consciously creating your relationships, the words that come out of your mouth, the emotional tone you can feel with and express. And this is where you're moving from warrior that needs to change to consciousness that's presence, to artist that's creating your life with presence and love and peace. Because it's not just about, hey, I feel this on the inside. I want this to be around me in the world I live in. I want to feel this going out to the people I love and care about, or strangers around me. I want to have it coming back to me. And so you start looking for people who are going to treat you with presence and love. So now we're building relationships, friendships, family relationships in a different way, community in a different way. That's where, to me, my vision of where we go in this community is about. And it's a shift for people who show up here to move out of the narrative story of identity with being a victim and judge to conscious presence and warrior and to artist. So that's the shift in both identity, agency, and responsibility of, hey, I am going to take charge of my stories and I'm going to move them and change them because I'm the one sitting with them. I'm the only one in here that has access to change them. And it's not the heat or the conversation or somebody else talking that's making us miserable at a certain point. It's like, wow, no, my story is about them. Or the internal stuff in the landscape that I need to change. And that's the responsibility bit and the warrior bit. We go, okay, that's my half. It's not that person sitting across from me in the sweat lodge that's talking. It's not the heat in the sweat lodge. It's my reaction and stories to it. And where is my attention focused? Where's my sense of identity? Is it centered with me? Or is it in a victim story, a judge story that's making me miserable? Okay, so that's the bit of awareness to have, and just a big picture on how your sense of identity and self will change as you do the work and make the journey. Anybody got questions, comments, want to share here? Let me know in the chat. Anybody even out there? I see some people are online. It's kind of wild. Hi, Paul. Glad you're here. Okay, people. Any questions? Anything to share? Good. Glad you found that helpful. I think you'll find all of the sessions in the self-mastery course recapitulation are going to have some aspect of addressing that shift in identity, shift in out of a story. Also, you'll find it in the energy trainings. You're shifting out of stories to these other points of view. And one of the things you'll notice when you do that is the stories, the ego mind, the character, say, a judge, a victim, get uncomfortable. They get uncomfortable that you're awake and you're not doing their story. So, what you'll notice in a lot of these lessons is they're not story-based. And I don't give you a lot of material to add to your stories. I try not to, but actually dismantle them and get free. But that's very uncomfortable for the mind. And one of the things you'll notice is fear comes up from the mind. So that's why every session pretty much will have some like, oh, here's the resistance you're likely to see. Here's the reaction from different character parts of what you're likely to see that will want to oppose making this change. And when you see that resistance, it's not a problem. It's actually telling you, good, I'm getting somewhere. If I'm trying to get free of this ego mind and fear-based belief system and it doesn't like it, then I'm probably on the right track. Okay. All right. Hope you find that helpful. Okay. And as we practice every day, we're in the sweat lodge. Every day, every moment, trying to find that balancing point and be present, be connected and present with ourself and our heart, and do our best to like, there's a story. I see it wants to get me. No, thank you. All right. Love you.